Hi, I'm Ros Lug, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on structured literacy. Now, just to start with some housekeeping, you'll have found some notes on our website, and you'll be emailed with a link when this recorded version of the webinar has been processed and uploaded. Now, as we go through, please feel free to send in your questions. I'll try and keep track of them and answer them as we go, but I will be remaining live at the end to go through questions and answers in more detail. And I'm happy to address any discussion points that come up at that point. And actually, even if we receive questions after we shut down the webinar, we will answer those on the website for your information. So please feel free to send those in. At the end of this webinar, what I've got my email address. And so I'm more than happy to engage with anybody who needs further information or would like to discuss any of these points in more detail. So now I hope this is okay. I'm going to give you a brief bit of detail about my background in this field. I started my teaching career as a language teacher, French, German and Spanish at secondary level in the UK. Then I retrained as an assessor and literacy specialist. Now, over the last 25 plus years, I've done over 3,000 full ed psych assessments, and that has, among other things, made me quite fascinated in the processing and perceptual skills which underlie literacy. And particularly, I'm interested in the literacy development aspect. And as a literacy specialist, I've been concerned for quite a while now about the confusion and misunderstandings surrounding two terms which have become common over the last few years. And those two terms, of course, are structured literacy, the science of reading, and actually for those of you who are UK-based, there's also the question of how those two terms fit in with the synthetic phonics approach. Now, one thing that concerns me is that I believe that there are some incorrect messages being sent as part of the structured literacy approach. And actually, there are also some elements which I believe that the pure synthetic phonics approach doesn't address. So what we're going to do is go and look at what those labels, if you like, stand for, but also some of the implications in terms of teaching methodology and interpretation of research. So what's in a name? Structured literacy or science of reading? Well, the first thing we're going to do is look at science of reading, and then we'll look at how structured literacy fits in with that. Now, there's actually quite a good, and then we'll talk about synthetic phonics as well. So there's actually quite a good definition of science of reading from the Reading League in the US. And you'll find this quite interesting. So excuse me reading verbatim from this, but it is actually quite crucial to this debate. The science of reading is a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading and writing. This research has been conducted over the last 5 decades across the world, and it's derived from thousands of studies conducted in multiple languages. And the description goes on to say, the science of reading has culminated in a preponderance of evidence to inform how proficient reading and writing develop, why some have difficulty, and how we can most effectively assess and teach, and therefore improve student outcomes through prevention of and intervention for reading difficulties. A bit long-winded, yes, but also quite a useful description of the whole essence and rationale of science of reading. So what we're actually talking about with science of reading is we're actually talking about a label which has quite recently been applied to the overall body of research about literacy. The key thing is it's not some new scientific discovery or advance in any way. And as those quotes show, some of this research goes back decades. Now, as a teacher and researcher in this field, the cynical part of me wonders why we suddenly need a label. Some of us have been teaching and assessing in accordance with this research for literally decades. However, the more pragmatic part of me recognizes that there's probably a benefit in the label if it makes people more aware of that research and its importance. And so the next question is, what exactly is structured literacy and how does it fit in? Well, the term structured literacy is actually a trademark term owned by the International Dyslexia Association in the US. They describe it as an approach grounded in the science of reading. But the key thing to be aware of here is that structured literacy is actually a methodology. It's not the underlying research itself. And this is where I'm concerned about misinterpretation or misunderstandings about the original research coming in. So what about synthetic phonics, the most common term within the UK? Well, the term synthetic phonics officially means identifying or being aware of individual sounds and blending them together. In other words, synthesizing them. And that term synthetic phonics is the UK version of what the USA National Reading Panel recommended as systematic phonics in the year 2000. Now, the key thing here is that synthetic phonics is absolutely consistent with structured literacy in terms of overall philosophy. But there are some elements, such as the emphasis on syllable rules, which are actually quite different. Incidentally, you might be interested to know that we've included a very interesting analysis of the historical perspective of systematic phonics in the notes that you can download from the website. We've also got some useful links that you might find actually quite fascinating reading. And our downloadable notes also include quite a useful diagram from the International Dyslexia Association, which shows the relationship between these different elements. And as some of you may have noticed, the printable notes for this presentation include some other elements which we haven't included in this webinar in detail for time's sake, but which are accessible in detail in other webinars on our website if you're interested. So what we can see here is, coming back to our presentation, we can see that structured literacy is actually a specific methodology, but science of reading is the underpinning research. So what we're going to do is look at the core principles. Now, the first of these, and this is the principles of structured literacy. Now, the first of these is that teaching must be explicit. In other words, the teacher explains and models key skills with well-chosen examples. Children aren't expected to develop those skills mainly by exposure and incidental learning. The next principle is that instruction must be systematic and cumulative with a planned sequence of instruction. Obviously, important prerequisite skills need to be taught before more advanced skills. For example, children aren't expected to tackle complex words before simpler ones. Fairly logical and sensible. Now, the next principle is that teaching needs to be diagnostic. Students need to be regularly screened and progress needs to be monitored. And actually, this is a very strong emphasis within structured literacy. And this means, of course, that students who need extra help are identified at an early stage. We're going to stress this point in just a moment. And then once we've identified difficulties, effective interventions provide opportunities to meet those students' needs. So it's emphasizing the need for prompt constructive feedback in response to student errors. And this, in my opinion, is actually one of the most important principles. Having worked with literally thousands of struggling learners over the years, the main thing that concerns me is that we're generally only picking them up when they've already failed. We're not necessarily seeing the early signs which show us that they need more support in those early stages. Now, on those same lines, the core principles state that assessments should be used to target specific skills needed by individual students. And of course, interventions need to be appropriately intensive according to those children's needs. Now, as an example of this principle, I'm going to show you our 4-tier response to intervention model, which does exactly that. And I'm sure you're much more used to the standard 3-tier intervention model. And the extra tier, as you'll see here, is our tier 2. Here, every student's needs are being met in an appropriate way, but every learner is following the same progression and using the same core materials. So I'll explain that extra tier 2 briefly. And my emphasis here is that the tier 2 students are the ones we often miss. These students are not students who are currently struggling or noticeably struggling or failing at the earlier stages. These are the students who do need that extra structure and cumulative learning from the very beginning if they're not to become our tier 3 and 4 learners down the track. And I believe, and I think there's plenty of evidence from our school statistics, that far too many of these learners actually become our medium and high need learners simply because we haven't met their needs sufficiently well in the early stages. And so hence my emphasis on identifying and addressing the needs of those tier 2 learners before they actually start to fail. And this is a strong emphasis in the structured literacy philosophy. Identify any difficulties at the earliest possible opportunity to stop them falling through the gaps in the first place. So coming back to structured literacy, we've covered the overriding principles. Now let's look at filling that circle. We'll be looking at the individual elements covered under structured literacy and what each element actually means. So the first one, of course, is phonology, the patterns of sounds in a language. And bear in mind, we're talking about just sounds and sound patterns, no text yet. The text comes in, of course, at the next stage, when we look at the sound symbol principle, which is, of course, phonic knowledge and skills. So here, of course, our students are learning how those sounds are represented by letters or letter patterns. The next one is syllables, which of course are word units. It's important for our learners to be aware, for example, that every syllable has a vowel sound. However, this is a caveat, from my point of view at least. I believe that the structured literacy approach includes a misunderstanding about this area. So we're going to come back to this in a bit more detail once we've done this overview. But the next one in our circle is morphology. Of course, this is an understanding of words and their relationships. And that includes the different forms of words, including suffixes and prefixes. Filling the circle more, syntax, of course, is the arrangement or order of words within a sentence. And in a broader sense, it's also the function of words in a sentence and includes an understanding of grammar. And the last one, semantics, a more broad understanding of the meaning of language, including, of course, comprehension and appreciation of written language. So, how does this work out in practice? Now, obviously, our chosen scope and sequence needs to be carefully planned. And we also need to avoid introducing confusable elements at the same time. The examples given here are BP confusion, for example, and multiple short vowel sounds simultaneously. But there are plenty of other examples. One thing I've often seen in teaching units in other materials is teaching several different ways of representing a sound at the same time. Personally, I'd always teach each one individually, incorporate enough practice to consolidate that learning, and only then have carefully planned activities where the learner has to differentiate between them and choose the appropriate option. Now, another principle, of course, is that we need to be providing children with ample opportunities to read text they can decode and comprehend. And this is another thing that we're going to come back in a bit more detail later, because this is actually quite a significant point. So at this point, I'm going to quickly recap a model you're probably very familiar with, the 5 big ideas in beginning reading, which is a fairly crucial model in reading development. And you'll see how closely that aligns with the structured literacy principles. Now, this was actually put together by the USA National Reading Panel. And as you can see here, is described as a progression which is sequential and cumulative, starting, of course, with phonological awareness, then phonic knowledge, reading fluency, and then vocabulary and comprehension. Now, there are a few people in this field who would quarrel with this depiction of reading development, and I certainly find it a very important model. However, there are some serious caveats when it comes to the structured phonics component. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you is what I believe is actually quite an important quote from that same National Reading Panel in the year 2000. And this quote is often overlooked. It's important to emphasize that systematic phonics instruction should be integrated with other reading instruction to create a balanced reading program. Phonics should not become the dominant component in a reading program, neither in the amount of time devoted to it, nor in the significance attached. And I believe actually that these quotes have somehow been forgotten in our zeal for structured phonics-based teaching. In my opinion, we've become a little bit unbalanced in our approach and forgotten about some of those additional important elements. But it is important to bear in mind, though, that what we're seeing here isn't actually a critique of structured literacy or synthetic phonics themselves, but just a statement that phonics teaching needs to be part of a broader literacy program and not an end in itself. And that's one idea we'll come back to when we look at some of the limitations of structured literacy. Now, I'm going to introduce you to a theory that might seem a little bit out of place when I first mention it, but bear with me, because I'm going to be referring back to this when we analyze some of the key misconceptions about structured literacy. Now, this theory is known as cognitive load theory. And one of its main messages is that learners can absorb and retain information effectively only if it's provided in such a way that it doesn't overload their mental capacity. In other words, if we want our learners to be able to process and retain information effectively, we need to focus on the key ideas and not clutter the task with other things to process. One key principle that comes in here is that you can't do two cognitive tasks at the same time. And this is particularly important for our debate on decoding. A cognitive task is defined as one that you need to think about, as opposed to a task which has become automatic to you. And so we'll see how this comes into play with several aspects of literacy as we progress. And there's a wide recognition that cognitive tasks can easily overload working memory. And we need to consider here that most of our struggling learners have difficulties with working memory. Incidentally, the definition of working memory is that it's the ability to retain and simultaneously process information. So one of the key messages here is that for us as teachers, we need to make as many aspects of literacy automatic for our learners as we can, so that they can focus on and process one element at a time. And this is particularly important when it comes to needing to consciously decode words, rather than being able to recognize words instantly, as we as fluent readers do. If you're reading a passage and you're having to consciously decode most of the words, you can't effectively follow the meaning. And of course, it's not exactly rewarding or enjoyable. And this cognitive load theory is one of the main reasons that I'm not keen on rule-based teaching in literacy. Now, I certainly use rules to explain why something is the way it is. For example, why the silent E or changes the sound of the vowel. However, I teach those patterns by first developing a phonic understanding of the word, but then by developing a visual, auditory, and kinesthetic memory for those words. Kinesthetic obviously also meaning the memory for movement, which is why handwriting is developmentally such an important thing at this stage. But then I carry on by providing enough varied reinforcement for those words to become automatic, both for reading and for writing. In other words, I'm actually making those words into sight vocabulary, which is another thing we'll talk about shortly. So we're going to come on to some key misunderstandings about structured literacy. And there are 4 key areas that we're going to go through. Now, to be honest, over the last few years, I've been quite dismayed about some of the things I've heard teachers say about how we should now be teaching our learners. Some are based on a misunderstanding of what structured literacy is, and some are based on a misinterpretation of some key research studies. So the first misunderstanding we're going to look at is actually that we should only be using decodable texts, no more leveled or graded readers. Let's examine that one a little bit more closely. The key principle here is that we shouldn't be encouraging students or letting students guess an unknown word from the context or from pictures. They should only be presented with texts which only contain words which they can decode at that stage, and a very, very small number of high-frequency words. Well, in principle, that sounds logical, but what you'll find is that what I believe is the important case here is that we actually need a balanced approach to reading. Certainly what we need to be doing is we need to be using decodable texts, but it's important, in my view, to present students with texts that they're going to be thoroughly enjoying reading, even if sometimes they guess at a word. The sky's not going to fall in if they occasionally guess at a word. So what I think we do is if we think about why we're reading at a decoding level, we're actually developing the kind of mechanical aspects, decoding obviously and word recognition, but we're also trying to develop that student's ability to understand text. But it's difficult because he's having to concentrate on the decoding process. And don't misunderstand me here. Of course, there's nothing wrong with reading to develop decoding and word recognition, providing that's not the only reading we're doing. I'll tell you a little story actually about my younger son. When he first started school, he was identified as being dyslexic and he was struggling with literacy, but he actually loved reading. And there was a stage when I was quite intrigued to see that although his official reading age was something like about reading age of 6.5, 7, he was quite happily reading Harry Potter. Now, the purists here in the structured literacy field would say, oh, no, I should never have let him read Harry Potter because he must be guessing at quite a few words. And I'm sure he absolutely was. But the reality was that he was following the sense enough to be enjoying reading the book. And alongside that, he was doing a structured literacy approach. So he was learning those decoding and encoding skills. He was learning phonic knowledge, and he was reading decodable texts. But he was also reading for enjoyment at a level which had things that were going to genuinely interest him. And so that's my main message here. Let's have a balance. Let's not make reading all about decoding. And of course, one of the things that we can do with some of these struggling learners is actually encourage them to listen to books, listen to text. The key thing here is we develop an enjoyment of books, whether they're listening to them or reading to them for themselves. And in that way, we can address those aspects of the 5 ideas, vocabulary and comprehension, which in a way which is not limited by their ability to read independently. And actually, arguably, listening to books is every bit as good as reading for themselves, even better in some respects. It's quite a good way of developing key skills like auditory processing, listening comprehension, auditory memory. So what we could ask ourselves, though, is if we don't restrict reading to material our learner can decode for themselves, how do we develop their phonic knowledge and decoding skills? Interestingly, my experience over the last 30-odd years of assessing and tutoring struggling learners is that those learners actually learn better through a spelling-based approach, providing it's done in the right way. Because if it's done in the right way, it'll develop all of the processing and perceptual skills needed for reading, and the knowledge needed for reading, the literacy knowledge. It'll also develop an understanding of the text. And if it includes the right kind of incidental and targeted reading activities to activate and develop that visual word form area of the brain, the part of the brain used by fluent readers, we're also working towards genuine reading fluency. And this way, this is where I feel looking at the concept of Scarborough's rope is quite important. Most of you will be familiar with this. It's described as the reading rope, but to be honest, the principles apply to spelling as well. And it incorporates all of the elements which are important for reading. We not only need to learn to spell the word correctly on a piece of paper, but we need to understand how to use it in a variety of contexts, not only to decode and encode that word, but also to recognize it instantly without conscious decoding, and to read and understand it in context. And this is what I feel is missing in many structured literacy-based schools. Spelling and reading are actually detached from each other. Busy teachers rely on the, here's your spelling list, I'll test you on Friday. So there's no time for contextualization, and also no opportunity for differentiation in terms of meeting different needs. In our program, StepsWeb, spelling is an integral and vital part of an overall literacy program, which aims actually to develop the core skills needed, core skills and knowledge needed for both reading and spelling. And actually, we see the same gains for comprehension and vocabulary as we do for reading and spelling. And the key thing is it gives you an automatic progression which runs right the way through your school and develops and enables every single learner to be working at their own individual level and speed. I'll tell you a bit more about the program at the end of the webinar if you're interested in trialing it. Now, there are a number of questions which arise here and some core principles which we need to keep in mind in a phonics-based approach. Obviously, a structured phonics-based literacy approach does need to include decoding words in context. We certainly need a strong element of this kind of reading. But be aware that you're only targeting the mechanical phonic aspects, not the intellectual ones. So, to sum up again, my advice would be don't do too much of this or make this their only experience of books. So, how can we then develop that decoding skill? Some decoding texts, obviously, but also, in my experience, we can teach that phonological awareness, phonic knowledge, and decoding skills more effectively and a lot more enjoyably through phonics-based literacy games and other activities. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a range of some of the activities that we've got on our program, which do exactly that. And there's nothing whatsoever wrong with reading-leveled readers as part of a varied, well-planned, broader reading program, which still prioritizes decoding and encoding. So we're going to look at another misconception about structured literacy and to a certain extent synthetic phonics. We've already looked at the idea that we must only use decodable texts, but the next misunderstanding, and I think this is quite a serious one, is that everything needs to be at the individual phoneme level. We shouldn't be teaching word families or onset and rhyme. Actually, this is a misunderstanding about what the International Dyslexia Association actually says. And there's some interesting research here. First, let's look at what the International Dyslexia Association identify as the 3 key phonic approaches commonly used in schools. There's the grapheme phoneme level, in other words, individual sounds. Then there's the onset and rhyme and the word families approach. We're going to look at each one of these. So in terms of grapheme phoneme level, working with individual sounds, we're looking at the word bat broken up into b, a, t, obviously. The second is onset and rhyme, where your single syllable word is broken into two chunks. And interestingly, the International Dyslexia Association regards the word families approach as being a third approach. Although, to be honest, I feel it's actually an offshoot from the onset and rhyme approach. It's certainly working with the same structures. And a key thing to be aware of here is that the IDA doesn't say you shouldn't use onset and rhyme or word families. It simply recommends that the initial introduction to reading words is on an individual phoneme level, and that we prioritize that individual phoneme level, which is something I would absolutely agree with. But there's some interesting findings here. Research by that National Reading Panel, the 5 Big Ideas people, found that there's no difference in effectiveness between those 3 approaches. Although some later research has found that an initial focus on grapheme and phoneme level can lead to better reading outcomes. And the emphasis here is on the outcomes for reading, not the outcomes for writing or spelling. So the key point I'm making here is that it's perfectly okay to include word families and onset and rhyme. In fact, there are key reasons for doing exactly that, and we're going to look at those shortly. But before we do, let's look at the development of phonological awareness, because it puts things in context. And one of the foundation stones is rhyme and syllabification. Now, these are both very relevant to that structured literacy debate. So we're going to be coming back to these in a bit more detail. Developmentally, the next level is your onset and rhyme stage. And only then do we get to the individual phonemes. So these are our foundation skills, and phonemic awareness is actually the most advanced level. And one of the key things here is that research shows very clearly that phonemic awareness, in other words, being aware and being able to manipulate those individual sounds, is not a natural stage of phonological awareness. It only comes about as a result of teaching. So one thing we need to also be aware of is that those processing individual phoneme stages are particularly challenging for our dyslexic learners. So working at that level is potentially a problem for those learners. Now, many of you in the UK will be aware of the fact that in 2021, I think it was, the British Dyslexia Association actually put forward a petition to the government to stop the emphasis on only working with individual phonemes for that very reason. Their conclusion was that working only at the individual phoneme level is actually failing at least 25% of our learners. Quite a significant issue, as you'll agree. Now, I said we'd look at rhyme and syllabification in a bit more detail. Now, rhyme recognition has long been recognised as it being important for early literacy. However, there are some major misconceptions here. And I've seen a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to interpreting some key research in this field. Now, a quite seminal study in the 1980s identified that rhyme recognition for 4 to 5-year-old pre-readers is the single most important predictor of later reading accuracy. However, some later research has established that the ability to identify individual phonemes is the most important predictor. And I've heard a number of teachers and also academics stating that this later research actually contradicts the earlier research and means that we should only be working at individual phoneme level. But this actually is ignoring what I believe is a crucially important point. That later research was actually done with 6-year-olds. In other words, here we're talking about children who'd already started their literacy journey and were already being taught phonic knowledge and phonemic awareness. So we're not really talking about a predictor here, whereas the previous study was with 4 or 5-year-old pre-readers, a very different situation. And I'm just veering off here just to have a look at a couple of comments that are coming in. Interestingly, there's a lot of agreement with the emphasis on onset and rhyme, which I'm very pleased to hear. I will try and keep track of any questions that come in as well. So if that stage of identifying individual phonemes in words is not a natural stage of phonological awareness, and if it's only developing as a result of literacy teaching, this is the wrong level for many of our learners, whereas breaking a word into onset and rhyme is a natural stage. So let's look at that process. And very interesting research here, which goes back several decades at least. Now, the very first stage in breaking words down into sounds actually starts with breaking sentences into words. And of course, here we're talking about babies, gradually learning to break a stream of sounds into individual words. The next stage was breaking words into syllables. And the final stage was thought to be breaking words or syllables into individual phonemes. However, some quite crucial research in this field has very clearly shown that there is an intermediate stage, which is that onset and rhyme stage. And onset and rhyme is important for several reasons. Obviously, that breaking a word into two chunks is significantly easier than breaking it into individual phonemes. Interestingly, I often use the example string when I'm doing teacher training courses. When I ask attendees to tell me how many sounds they can hear, the answers range from 2 to 6, which is always quite entertaining. The reality actually is that working with individual phonemes is complex, not a natural process. Remember our cognitive overload. And how many times in real life do you need to break words into individual sounds? Whereas two chunks is infinitely easier. So let's go back to another aspect of the rhyme issue. And the key thing also is that rhyme development is particularly significant for developing analogical transfer. Now, if you're not familiar with this term, analogical transfer is the ability to recognize patterns in words, sound patterns in words, and also apply that to work out unknown words. Now, I know that sounds a little bit abstract and the relevance is not immediately obvious. So I'm going to tell you a story here. When I was first doing my training in this field, I had to assess, teach, and then reassess a learner in each one of the three main age categories: primary, secondary, and adult. Now, my primary learner was a lovely kid called Daniel, who was 7 at the time. And he was one of those interesting kids who didn't have an inner voice. So he was constantly talking out loud. And so it was very easy to follow how he was thinking. We got to the second spelling test and we got to the word wall. Now, he was talking out loud to himself and he said to himself, he thought for a second and then said to himself, "Oh, I can't spell wall. I don't know wall." Then he thought for a moment and he said, "Oh, but I know ball." And I thought, yes. What's that told me? It's told me I haven't just taught him a whole string of individual words. I've taught him a skill that he can use to work words out for himself. Now, let's imagine what he would have been doing if he hadn't developed analogical transfer. If he had only been working with individual phonemes, this is probably what would have happened. He'd have probably got the W sound. By this stage, I think he probably had managed an O sound as well. And then he would definitely have got the L sound at the end. Isn't that what we're teaching learners to do? Listen to the individual sounds and encode them? Whereas what he did was he saw the analogy between wall and ball and recognized how to spell that word. Analogical transfer, in my opinion, is crucial, particularly at these early literacy stages. So if we go back to that research that we were looking at just now, an initial focus on grapheme phoneme level can certainly lead to better reading outcomes, but an awareness of onset and rhyme and word families simplifies the writing task hugely. Now, the other thing about onset and rhyme is actually you can make 500 common words from only 37 rhymes. Now, we've organized them for you in a handout, which you can access from the notes section, but I'll quickly show you them here. I've organized them in an order which of complexity and usefulness, but that's just a suggestion. So to sum up here, working only at the individual phoneme level is challenging to many learners. Work should include onset and rhyme and word families. And in fact, I would actually suggest it should be a priority in those early stages. And here we have some other activities that develop that onset and rhyme aspect. You'll see here, this is purely a sound one. This is sound chunks, blending sounds together. Blending those onset and rhyme in terms of text, but also incorporating activities which do work on individual phonemes. We need, I believe, to have a balance in these activities. We need to be incorporating all of these aspects. So let's come back now to our key misunderstandings. And this time what we're going to look at is syllable rules. And I've been quite intrigued to see what's being said about this. So let's look at syllabification and what that actually means. Now, first of all, we have auditory syllabification, which is basically the ability to break a spoken word down into sound chunks. That's the most common error for the word remember. And it's very clearly showing us that this learner hasn't been able to hear the chunks in that word. But the other aspect is syllabification rules. And these are actually rules which tell you how to break written words into syllables, which actually in real life we very rarely need to do, but never mind. So anyway, in my opinion, auditory syllabification is the key aspect we need to teach. And it's literally the ability to hear the chunks or beats in a word. And there's a very easy way of teaching it. I teach my students to hold the hand underneath their chin and say the word. The number of times your chin touches your hand is the number of syllables. And coming on to syllabification rules, though, things get considerably more tricky. Now, according to structured literacy, there are 6 types of syllables. To be honest, I wouldn't have described the silent E pattern, vowel pairs, R-controlled vowels as syllables, but that's what the structured literacy movement describes them as. And teachers are encouraged to teach the rules for identifying and using each type of syllable. Now, my response to that, to be honest, would be to point to that cognitive load theory we were looking at earlier. I do believe that rule-based teaching leads to cognitive overload, particularly for our dyslexic and other struggling learners. Actually, I've got a technical comment here, which we're going to look into briefly. Sound has gone from presentation. Thank you for that comment, Rebecca. Our techies will just take a look at that straight away. And of course, you can't hear that, but never mind. I hope this is not affecting other people. Please let us know if it does. Okay, I've just had an indication that it is clear. So apologies for any temporary difficulty there. So, right. So we're talking about the cognitive overload for our struggling learners. And actually, those struggling learners are the very last ones to remember the rule and to figure out when to apply it while they're trying to do a literacy task at the same time. But my other concern is the reliability of syllabification rules. And there's a very interesting article by an academic called Devon Kearns, who's analysed this aspect in quite a lot of detail. He's actually found that reliability for different types of syllable rules is actually very variable. His opinion basically was there are actually very few usable patterns in terms of syllabification rules. And other quite key researchers, including Linnea Airy here, have found that those approaches that taught rigid syllabification rules for spelling or spelling rules for syllabification didn't improve reading. But those that aimed in flexibility in the use of syllables to decode words did significantly better. And this just shows another one of those activities that is certainly building an awareness of syllables and rules, but without teaching those rigid rules. And a comment coming through here, useful to teach rule-based teaching? Yes, absolutely, but only when linked to the spelling pattern and not useful when taught in isolation. totally agree, and thank you for that comment. So that's was our syllable rules. Our fourth one is that we shouldn't be teaching sight vocabulary. Now, I've been told some quite well, amusing and if in some ways a little bit depressing comments on this one. I have actually been told that we shouldn't have sight words anymore because reading is not a visual process. Well, being a bit of a cynical type of person, I I was very tempted to say, well, try closing your eyes and doing it, but I was tactful for once. Sight vocabulary is one of those things which is very, very contentious at the moment. So let's look at what sight words actually are, or more importantly, what they should be. Well, we generally consider sight vocabulary to be those high-frequency words, in other words, the most important words, which are either irregular or not yet decodable within that learner's knowledge. The typical example might be the word was. It's a very common word. I think it's one of the top 20 words in the English language. But it comes up at a very early stage, well before they've learnt that rule about the letter A changing its sound after W. So to give a little bit more detail here, sight words are actually those words that have been orthographically mapped to the visual word form area of the brain, so they no longer need to be decoded. Once stored in that visual word form area of the brain, which I'm highlighting here on your screen, they can now be recognized without conscious decoding. As you're probably aware, that illustration of the brain is showing three key areas. The two towards the front of the left hemisphere are your decoding areas, and the one that's highlighted towards the base of the left hemisphere is what's commonly known as the visual word form area. When we as fluent readers look at a word, we don't have to consciously decode it. We can look at it and instantly recognize it within a tiny fraction of a second. And we're using that visual word form area. So what we're seeing is that it's important to transfer those high frequency or important words to the visual word form area as early as possible. So in other words, instead of those being words that learner still has to struggle to decode or remember, they have become automatic. And the more high frequency words stored in that area, the more the brain can concentrate on decoding the other words in a sentence. So in terms of misunderstandings, many people are saying a sight word is a word that has been learnt purely by its visual pattern. And there's a very strong feeling against that for obvious reasons. Absolutely not. A sight word is a word which has initially been decoded or its phonic structure has been explained. As an example, let's look at the word said. If I was working with a learner, we'd sound that word out. We'd get the first sound. I'd then explain that the AI in this word actually says the E sound, and then we'd manage the final D sound. So here we're using those decoding areas in the brain, Broca's area and the parieto temporal in particular. But then that word is repeatedly seen and, if necessary, decoded in the same way until it becomes a sight word, which can be recognized automatically without decoding. And that means it's been orthographically mapped and is now stored in that visual word form area. So let's look at why sight vocabulary is so important. By definition, they're common words which will be met frequently in the early stages. But also, the more words that can be instantly visually recognized in the early stages, the quicker that learner will make the transition to being a fluent reader. And this leads to a model that I find particularly useful in terms of the key phases a learner goes through. And this is from linear areas, you're probably aware. That very, very early stage, the logographic stage, is the stage that most 4 or 5-year-olds are at. And they're visually recognizing a very tiny number of high frequency or significant words, the name, for example. And at this stage, they are recognizing those words visually because they don't yet understand that phonemic code. But as they start to learn that letter sound correspondence, they transfer into the alphabetic phase, which, as the name suggests, is where they start to use that letter sound knowledge and phonological awareness, of course, to be able to decode and encode regular words. But then they move into that orthographic phase, where they can now recognize words visually without consciously decoding them. In other words, they're now genuinely fluent readers. And unfortunately, there's considerable evidence that many of our learners never manage that final transition. You might be interested in a more detailed explanation of this process and the neurological implications, which is in our literacy development webinar that you'll also find on the website. But on the practical side of things, and this is just illustrating which parts of the brain are being used at those key stages. But on the practical side of things, as a teacher, the understandable question is, so how do I know? How can I tell when my students start to use that visual word form area for orthographic mapping? And this is where I'm going to show you some of the most up-to-date research in this field. There are a number of supporting research studies that suggest that the visual word form area operates at around 150 milliseconds or faster. Now, in other words, if a student is able to visually recognize a word at or faster than that speed, it's an indicator that they must be using the visual word form area for instant recognition, rather than consciously decoding that word. Well, it's now possible for you to measure that speed as a teacher. We've actually developed a test which measures the speed, literally measures how many milliseconds it takes a learner to visually recognize a known word. And it's built into our program, StepsWeb. And as a result of having that test, we've also been able to establish the average speeds at each age, which is what you're seeing on the screen now. So it's perfectly normal that our 5-year-old learners are not yet using the visual word form area. But by the time the average learner is 8 to 9 or maybe 10 years old, they're transitioning to using instant visual recognition using that correct area of the brain. And here are some genuine results. This is actually my grandson, Jake, who is dyslexic. And you can see when he first started StepsWeb in May 2019, he was scoring at 750 milliseconds, which is on the low range even for his age at the time. A year later, he was scoring at 150 milliseconds, and now he's scoring at 50 milliseconds, which is the optimal speed. So how do we actually develop visual recognition speed? Luckily, it's not complicated. Plenty of exposure to words in lots of different contexts. Reading, literacy games, a whole range of different things. And that exposure is continually reinforcing creating and reinforcing those neural images of those words. In other words, what they're doing is they're orthographically mapping those words to the visual word form area, which means that now they can be retrieved automatically. So the message here is that the phonics only route is not sufficient. The danger is that we can land up with a good decoder, but still not a fluent reader. We actually need to have a balanced approach, utilizing a range of strategies, activities, and materials to cover all of those important bases, and particularly to help our learners transition from conscious decoding to genuine reading fluency. We need a logical, systematic, phonics-based scope and sequence, which covers all the principles we've talked about within the structured literacy model. But we also need a structure which is continually going back, rechecking, and, if necessary, reteaching. This is the concept that I describe as a circular progression. We're making progress, but we need to check that that progress has been retained and, if necessary, reteach. So over a period, our progress looks more like this. It's not good enough to just go through a progression of phonic patterns, however logical that progression is. We need to be constantly going back and checking that those phonic patterns have been retained and can be used in a variety of different contexts. And this illustrates how that can actually happen. This is an illustration of the activities for one word list on StepsWeb, and you can see the word list in the bottom right-hand corner, concentrating on the oo sound. Those purple tiles each represent one of the activities which practice those words in different ways. These are the ones which develop phonological awareness and phonic knowledge. These are the reading and spelling ones. Here you can see ones which concentrate on vocabulary and comprehension, including syntax. And there are also activities which develop key aspects of memory. Treasure hunt, for example, the last one of those activities is a working memory activity. And as students work through the structured course, the program is continually analysing their errors and creating individualised reinforcement. Another example of that circular progression. Now, we're coming to the end of this webinar, but I wanted to point you in the direction of this link. You'll find some fascinating research discussions and so on this site, all referring to literacy teaching. And in particular, I'd highlight this document, which you can actually read directly from the site on screen. It's about fact-checking science of reading principles, and it provides some really interesting insights into the conclusions that people have come to on the basis of current research. And interestingly, one of the comments here in this document is that although the science of reading is an important story, it is, in their words, not the only story. It cautions against too narrow or prescriptive a view on teaching phonics and encourages teachers, as I hope I've been, to take a broader perspective on this whole thing. Now, as I said before, you'll find notes on our website, quite a few supporting notes as well, including a very interesting document, as I say, on the development of synthetic phonics. Now, I'm going to stay online to answer any queries, but if you do have any questions afterwards, feel free to send them in. I've got my email address at the end of this presentation, and I'm happy to answer any individual queries. And if you're interested in any further webinars, please sign up to our newsletter that you'll find on our website. And we've got a special offer for you as well. If you'd like a free trial of our program, StepsWeb, please let us know. What we're going to be offering you is a free, for UK schools, a free unlimited trial until the end of September 2024. Together with a free PD package, and that's individualized Zoom training for you and support for your school to get you going. With schools outside the UK, contact us and we can sort out dates to suit. And to sign up and to take advantage of this special offer, go to our homepage, click on the free trial button and enter this code. So this is a few useful links that you might find interesting. I don't know quite why we've gone off of there. Hang on a second. There we go. And on the notes, you'll see my email address, which, as I say, you're welcome to contact me on. So what I'm going to do is thank you very much for joining us. I hope you found this useful. I know we've raced very quickly through a very complex area. And I'm going to stay online now to answer any other questions that come through. There's one question that I've noticed here saying really like to have the slides and recording. The recorded version is going to be on our website and you'll get an email from that. If you would like to have a copy of those slides, drop me an email. It's ros@stepsweb.com and I can certainly send them to you. And again, thanks for joining us.